Writing this test is actually pretty tricky, and so I want to start off by editing the test helper. We're going to add a method to log users in inside of tests. I mentioned before that we were going to do this, but now the time has come. It's especially tricky because the way we log users in will depend on whether it's a regular sort of controller or model test, or if it's an integration test. This is just a quick insert with an updated way for writing this login method inside of tests. The way to do this has changed as of Rails 5, so we need to update the method. It's still true that it's going to be different based on different kinds of tests, but actually the controller and integration tests are unified, and the model tests will be different. So let's take a look at that. So open the test helper here. And inside of this here active support test case, we can look at this user test. It's the kind of test for a model test, like that, active support test case. So inside of here, this is going to be the thing that will get called in a model test. We actually won't use this in this lesson, but we'll use it later. And this is going to be really simple. We're just going to manipulate the session directly. We're going to say log in as, and then just the user. And then we're going to say the session of user ID is just that user's ID. Unfortunately, this method won't work inside of integration tests, which is now also the class for controller tests. To here, action dispatch integration test. But what we can do is open up that class inside here. We can just copy it. And then we'll add in the login method. And we'll just use the same name because we don't really want to have to keep track of which kind of test we're in. It doesn't really matter to us. So we'll do this, and as we'll see, we'll actually have to change this. It just says login as user, but we'll have to do something else here. Because inside of an integration test, which is also the same as a controller test now, in terms of the class, the way to log in is to post to the login path. We'll post the params session, and we'll put in the user email. So that's the email parameter. But then we also need the user password. And the problem here is that users don't know their own passwords. There's a password digest, but this here has to be the plain text password. So what we're going to do is add that to the login as method as a keyword argument. We're just going to use the default here, but it's nice to have it as an option so we could change it. Remember, user.yaml, we just standardized on user.digest of password. So the string password is just the standard password, and we'll be using that convention for other users as well in the test database. So here the password is password. And it's important to emphasize that this here is what gives rise to this here. So I could call this foo. If this were foo, this would be foo. So we just use the same name for convenience, but it can be a little confusing. And then there's one more thing we can do. Remember, when we post the login path through the form, there's a remember me checkbox too. So let's add that in here. And that's going to be, well, either 0 or 1. Let's just make it 1 by default. So for true, we do want them to remember me. There we go. We should be ready to test now. So now we're ready to go back to the previous version of the screencast with this new method, but otherwise the code should work as indicated. And now we're in a position to test that the login functionality is working with the two different kinds of checkboxes. So that's going to go in the user's login test right here. this over here. And I'm going to make a couple of new tests. We'll start with login with remembering. So let's log in as, well, we've got an @user, right? Yep, we've got an @user from the fixtures, so let's do login as that user. And then remember me is going to be 1. And now we have to decide how we're going to test this exactly. It's possible to check that the cookie of remember token is actually equal to the user's remember token, but the implementation is a little tricky, and that's left as an exercise. Instead, what we'll do is almost as good, which is to check that the cookie is not nil. You might expect that this would work. Assert not nil, cookies of remember token. And indeed, I expected this to work, but you can see that it does not work. Expected nil to not be nil. And the reason it didn't work is because of this really weird little subtlety that has been around for years, so far as I can tell, that inside tests, cookies of a symbol remember token does not work, but cookies of the string remember token does. So this should pass. There we go. So we can copy this, log in without remembering, remember me 0, and this should be assert nil. There we go. By the way, this catches that error I mentioned, where I said I did this when I first implemented it. See, that now fails. Expected this remember token to be nil, but it wasn't. So that's this failing right here.